deadlines. Saying, hey, we have my sisters listening, write me a symphony. The days before the Mac, the days before the keyboard, where you literally only had to write the music, but then write out every single part with those horrible ink smudges. The fact that this music has survived almost 250 years is beyond me. That we still have it with us. That music somehow traveled and landed in Nashville in 2012. I don't know about you, but that's just human. That's impossible. I don't think Haydn would have ever dreamed of something like that. But this was his life for 30 plus years. Of course, we know the symphony. But in the same token, he perfected the string quartet, the piano sonata. Well, not only orchestra, he also had to write chamber music. And Mr. Esterhazy, who himself was an amateur musician, wanted music written for him. And Haydn, being the good employee that he was, always made sure that he wrote music that was available to Mr. Esterhazy so he could play it and not be too frustrated. Whenever the Esterhazys traveled, either to their summer home, or their winter home, or their home in Vienna, there went the whole orchestra, and the court orchestra, and the dancers, and the singers, because Mr. Esterhazy needed to be entertained. Great stories, of course, came out. I mean, of the 104th Symphony, many of them have nicknames, because something happened when these pieces were written. My favorite, of course, being the Farewell Symphony, which you know, the musicians are supposed to get up and leave at the end. But that was not an accident. That was because they had been in the summer home for a long time, for about 3 months now, and the musicians were becoming restless. I mean, they missed their family. They wanted to go home. But it seems that Nicholas Esterhazy was having a little too much fun, and he had no plans of leaving. So Haydn found a cute way to maybe making a subliminal case for it. So during the performance of the 45th Symphony, the Farewell Symphony, as it became to be known, he asked the players to get up, and Esterhazy picked up on the message, and the next day, everybody was on the road back to their home. By the way, you should know that the titles of the symphonies were never given by the composers themselves. The titles were given either by critics, many times they were given by audiences, and that is the one way that we keep track of these symphonies. Who remembers the D minor symphony? Or the G flat major symphony, or the F minor symphony? We remember the Farewell Symphony, the Bear, the Hen, Surprise, Miracle, Drum Roll, London, Passione, Morning, Midday. Make your pick. And tonight, Military. This one is part of a series of symphonies, the last symphony that Haydn wrote. And they're part of a collection known as the London Symphony. A man by the name of Johann Peter Solomon, who was an impresario, German impresario, who had been in London since 1781 as a violinist, performer, but more importantly, an impresario, somebody that put concerts together. He happened to be in Europe in 1788 when he heard through the news, I guess through the internet, that Nicholas Esterhazy had just died. And that the son of Nicholas Esterhazy, whose name I didn't even bother to learn because he was a complete idiot, decided to disband the orchestra. This was a man who was so uncultured. He did not get anything from his father other than the money, which, by the way, he pilfered the entire fortune from the Esterhazy. This young man was a complete and absolute idiot. And the first order of business that he did when his father passed away was to get rid of anything that had to do with culture, beginning with firing all of the musicians, all of the singers, and more importantly, Haydn. So Haydn went back to Vienna. Fortunately, I mean, he was well known by this time, so he didn't have a problem keeping alive for himself. But this man, Johann Peter Solomon, had heard that Haydn was unemployed. So he showed up in his house, knocked on his door, and said, "I am Solomon, I have come to fetch you. And I will give you 1,000 pounds for you to write me an opera and 6 symphonies." Haydn at this time is almost 60 years old. Remember, he's been working in the same family for 30 plus years. And he said, "Sure, I'll go to London." By this time, remember, he had spent his time in this family's household. How famous could I be? So he is convinced, before he leaves Vienna, in 1791, he makes one last visit to a close friend, Mozart. And they say goodbye, and none of them would imagine that this would be the last time that they would see each other. Mozart would die only a couple of months later. So Haydn sets off to London. We know from letters to his mistress that the trip from Calais to Dover was very rough. But in the letter he says that he made it through without getting sick. They make it to London, and you want to talk about being treated like a superstar? This was the first time that Haydn got to see really how popular he was. In Europe, and particularly London. During this entire visit there, he got to hear 5 or 6 orchestras playing 10 or 12 of his symphonies. He got to hear his cantata, Ariane of Nashville, and in one of the performances, he was actually invited to come up and play on the harpsichord with the audience standing. The Prince of Wales invited him to dinner at his residence, the Culture House. The Queen invited Haydn to attend the court's ball. He was front row at the Handel's commemoration of Westminster Abbey, where Handel is buried, and he heard a bunch of choral music. And it is there that Haydn became inspired to write perhaps his 2 greatest choral works, The Seasons and The Creation. And last but not least, Oxford gave him a doctorate. So this was the type of reception that Haydn got when he gets to London. And that's what I mean when I told you that Haydn got to really understand the level of popularity. The London audiences ate it a lot. The concert that Haydn did when he was there were held at 2 different halls. Hanover Court, the Hanover Square Theater, which was a hall pretty much like ours, shoebox, housed about 800 people, always completely sold out to the rafters. And the other one was the King's Theater, which is about 700 people, horseshoe, always sold out. And this is where the London symphonies were performed. Among them, 92, Oxford, 94, Surprise, because you know in the second movement there's a very loud symphony, that's why it's called a surprise. That's a nickname. The Miracle 96, because apparently at the premiere, a big chandelier fell, and miraculously nobody was hurt. 103, drum roll, because he opens with a drum roll. 101, because there's a moment it calls the clock, because there's one moment that it sounds like a clock. This one tonight, military, it is because it calls for janissary percussion. It uses military machine, which remember, in those days, the orchestra, the only percussion instrument you would ever see was a timpani. But here you have bass drum, cymbals, and triangle played in an orchestra. After the Ottoman Empire, which of course was a very scary time for Europe, this is after this whole area, one of the things that people romanticized about were the janissaries, which were the Turkish army musicians, which their main job was to be in front of the attack and literally be as loud as they could, bring these very loud percussion, trumpets, horns, and their job was to literally be in the front of the army, and as they were advancing, they were supposed to make the biggest rockets and the loudest sound to scare the other side. It was an honor to serve as a janissary commander because it meant you would be the first one to die. It was a kamikaze mission every single time. Fortunately, in the latter part of the 18th century, the janissaries were now not so scary, and there were a lot of Turkish bands, janissaries, traveling all over Europe. Mozart used them in his opera, The Abduction from the Sarajevo, and now Haydn felt that they had room in this. So, in the symphony you're going to hear tonight, in the second and the last movement, there is the unusual, by 18th century standard, addition of percussion instruments. The title military, actually we know where it came from. After the piece was premiered, it became a huge hit. We know from one of the reviews from the time that after the performance of the second movement, the audience went berserk. People started screaming, encore, encore, encore. The lady who normally is supposed to sit there, they were dancing. There were reports of women just completely jumping like the man. The piece was anchored 4 times at the second movement at its premiere. And over the next year, the piece would be played at least 20 times. And it was in one of the next newspapers that the piece was going to be played next, that they actually said, "Coming soon, new symphony by Haydn with the military movement." And that, I guess, the title stuck. The second movement that you're going to hear tonight is not original. Haydn had already written that music about 10 years earlier, and he used it for a piece that he wrote for King Ferdinand IV of Naples. And I love talking about the symphony because of one thing. The piece that Haydn wrote for this king in Naples actually was written for a very unusual instrument called the lira organizzata. Well, I actually like the English name better. The hurdy-gurdy. That is one of the reasons that I love to talk about the symphony, because I get to say hurdy-gurdy. And for those of you who don't know what a hurdy-gurdy is, it is a very weird contraception that it was something that was built in that era, some weird machine that was actually looked like a sitar. It had a crank that you moved, and that crank moved a bow, and then you had keys on the left hand. And this king apparently was very good at it, and Haydn wrote a concerto for it. And the music that you hear in the second movement of the military symphony is just basically recycled from this concerto. And because the music is mechanical, that, I guess, is where the percussion has a big presentation. Boom, boom, you can almost hear the crank. It's unavoidable. So I can see why Haydn thought of this as a kind of a cute thing to add to the orchestra. You're going to love the symphony. It's 4 movements, begins with a slow introduction. As I said, the percussionists have their moment in the second and the last movement, but the third movement is vintage Haydn, being your standard Austrian minuet. And the last movement is a rondo. What is a rondo? To give you the music school definition: A, B, A, C, A, D, A, E. You have the one melody A that keeps coming back all the time. But in Haydn's hand, you hear his sense of humor. The music becomes almost like a tongue-in-cheek dance. And all of a sudden the music stops. And it goes again, and then he starts messing with your head. He really showcases the sense of humor that I think especially the London audiences must have been charmed by. To have that level of irony, that level of just sarcasm, they must have just completely ate it up. He was specifically written for that audience who loves a good joke. Everybody loves a good joke, but nothing like the British, you know? And especially to see one of the most respected German composers be pulling tricks like this, it must have been just absolutely incredible for them. So this symphony, special, close attention not only to, of course, the beauty of the music, but more importantly, the personality of Haydn. And of course, with the addition of the percussion, you're in for a special treat. After that symphony, we do another symphony, this time in the 21st century. Unlike Haydn, the Doctor Atomic Symphony actually is based closely and closer to Sibelius' 7th Symphony, which is unusual because it is in one movement. It is still in 3 parts, but it is continuous. Unlike Haydn's Military Symphony, which has 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th with breaks in between, the Doctor Atomic Symphony is 3 parts, but non-stop music. John Adams, American composer, more importantly, living American composer, is by all accounts and by far the most performed living composer in the world. Not only American, but of all time. To this day, John Adams, like Haydn, is able to enjoy fame during his lifetime. We don't have to wait for him to die to appreciate it. He has been able to enjoy complete fame. And definitely the most respected and most performed American composer, and like I said, the most performed composer, period, in the world. His fame really came in the 1980s when he was composer in residence of the San Francisco Symphony. But I guess you don't reach that pinnacle until you've written the most complex and complicated art form that there is. And it's not the symphony, it's actually the opera. You think writing a symphony is hard, imagine writing an opera. I'm working with librettists and stagehands and all of that stuff. And it was in the 80s that John Adams wrote his first opera, which is now actually part of the standard repertoire, Nixon in China. And it's actually a historical snapshot of that very important visit that Nixon made to Mao in 1972. And based on description from people that were actually there, Adams actually put together an opera. And to this day, it's remarkable to say that an opera from the 1980s is still a part of the standard repertoire, very much like Tosca or La Boheme are. After that, he wrote another opera called The Death of Queen Opera, which is actually based on the hijacking of the Italian cruise ship Aquila Lauro. Some of you might remember this, but Palestinian terrorists. And more importantly, it was that very gruesome moment where they actually murdered one of the hostages, who was an American who was in a wheelchair, and they actually threw him overboard. So you see the connection of what Adams is doing when he writes his operas. He's talking about historical events, you know, that have many of us, because of TV, were actually witnesses to. The last opera that he wrote, actually, is this one that where this music comes from. It's Dr. Atomic, which was written for the San Francisco Opera, premiered in 2005. Just recently, it's a 21st century opera, and it tells the story of the test at Trinity, test site of the atomic bomb in 1945 in New Mexico. It's a subject that we can all relate to. Those of us who grew up in the Cold War, we remember the drills. This is where it all started. But the whole opera is about basically Oppenheimer's misgivings about whether this should be a kind of warmth that needed to be opened. And what his job as a physicist, but more importantly as a human being, should he proceed with this? And of course the questions are unanswered. I mean, we know what happened. But you can only imagine how difficult it must have been for the people involved in this project, knowing very well what they were doing, the implications of what this would be. So it's a very powerful message, and one of the reasons I think that this piece has become so popular, very much like Nixon in China, it has become part of the standard repertoire, is that we all understand the subject very well. We know it, and we understand it, and we are afraid of it in many ways. Unlike Haydn's military vision, which is actually in many ways almost funny, to pair it with Adams' vision of the military in a very ominous and actually world-destroying way, it's not so funny, but it still touches us very deeply. The symphony, of course, is, I would say, the greatest hits from the opera, the orchestral hits from the opera. The opera is in 2 acts. It's not very long, it's about 2 hours altogether. But Adams felt that in many ways, the libretto kept getting in the way of the music. John Adams always believed that because the opera had to tell a story and you had singers and you had to do this, he always felt that the orchestral music, the music itself, always had to take a second part in the telling of the story. So he felt that he was underdeveloped. So as soon as he was done with the opera, he felt, I need to write a symphony based on this music. Because there were things here that I wanted to do more of, but because the singers had to be there, he had to keep, providing that. The symphony actually premiered 2 years later after the premiere of the opera. It premiered in 2007. It is a co-commission between Carnegie Hall, the BBC in London, and the St. Louis Symphony. It was premiered by David Robertson, who's the music director of the St. Louis Symphony, and it is actually dedicated to him. The piece, as I said, is in one movement, but it has 3 parts. The first part is the laboratory, the second part is panic, the last part is Trinity. To give you a little synopsis of the opera, the piece begins at the test site in Alamogordo, in New Mexico, in June of 1945. The Germans had just surrendered, and physicist Robert Wilson started gathering some of the other physicists in the site, and they started to run a petition. They want to sign a petition signed by all of the scientists involved in the project, and send a letter to Truman and say, now that the Germans have surrendered, let's cancel this project. Oppenheimer has just returned from Washington, from meeting with the president, and it is at that meeting that you can't do this with the president, and they just made the decision that they're going to bomb civilian targets in Japan. So this is moving on. In the same token, Leslie Gross, who was the general in charge, the military general in charge of the Manhattan Project, is pushing every day, give me the bomb, we are not going to invade Japan, just give me the bomb so we can get this over once and for all. One of the most important characters in the opera is Oppenheimer's wife, Kitty. Kitty Oppenheimer becomes basically his conscience, who constantly is telling Robert, really, do you want to move on this? She starts quoting poems, and she starts quoting things about life. To make matters even more interesting, their maid, Pascualita, is actually a Native American woman, and she starts quoting all sorts of things that have to do with things that her elders foresaw. So it is a very interesting combination of some superstition things and some, obviously, some historical and more educated, if you want to call it, aspects of these personalities. The second act opens a few hours before the test, which is July 16, 1945, and everybody's in panic. There's a horrible electrical storm taking place, and the bomb is actually hanging from a tower in the middle of one of the worst electrical storms. Of course, everybody's freaking out. So what is this going to do? What if lightning hits this thing? You have the chief meteorologist saying we need to stop it. We can't do this with this type of electrical activity. You have the Surgeon General, the chief of the Army Corps of the Medical Corps, basically saying, have we really explored what plutonium and radiation poisoning is? Should we worry about that? Imagine what it must have been like to not know what they themselves are doing. Another scientist says, there could be a chain reaction with the explosion that could literally destroy the atmosphere. And Oppenheimer is hearing all this on one side, and on the other side he has Leslie Groves, the general, saying, blow it out, give it to me right now, I demand that you make this test, go ahead. Of course, I need to tell you how the story ends. But what's amazing in the opera is that we don't see the actual detonation. The opera finishes 10 seconds before the actual detonation. In the last moment of the opera, the last thing you see is people covering, looking for cover, and you hear the speaker, 10 minus 1, and as it starts, and all of a sudden everything just goes dark 10 seconds before. And as the opera ends, it's the beginning of an era. We don't need to see the detonation. We know what happened. So it is one of the most powerful pieces, and in the music that you're going to hear tonight, I think it captures perfectly this whole moment in history that we are still debating in many ways. And the fact that Oppenheimer called the test site Trinity was in honor of the three-person God. And in one of the most powerful moments, which actually closes the opera, one of the greatest solos is the trumpet playing of the aria by Oppenheimer, singing, "Batter my heart, three-person God." He's really struggling. In one moment, he actually thinks about, what if I were to kill myself? And what is one life worth saving the rest of humanity? He deals with those things. You can only imagine how difficult it must have been for somebody like him to have this type of pressure on him. And again, we know what happened. But you should know that in the opera, you basically are presented with the same conflicts that not only Oppenheimer, but everybody around him were dealing with on a daily basis. This is, I think, a performance that you will never forget, because it is really it really showcases John Adams at his best. The drama and the fantastic music that just really tell a story without the need of saying one word. After the break, we go to Brahms' first piano concerto, which is very different from the Dr. Atomic, but there's still a lot of drama in it. There is a love triangle in the Brahms' first piano concerto. There is. Johannes Brahms had just met his hero, Robert Schumann, who actually had said in one of his writings, here is the chosen one. Here is the heir to Beethoven. Can you imagine being called that at 20? That's what Brahms was called. Good-looking guy. By the way, those of you who think of Brahms, bearded guy, letting himself go, this is not him. This is the 20-year-old, good-looking, shy, who just met Robert Schumann. More importantly, he met Clara Schumann. Robert Schumann, this is 1854. Robert Schumann started having hallucinations. He was actually going crazy. That would land him in an insane asylum. Yes, that did happen. And Clara, his wife, was pregnant with their 7th child. Clara herself was, by the way, a fantastic pianist, fantastic composer. And Brahms basically became Clara's confidant and Clara's best friend, nothing more. There are a lot of mentions in their letters about the unanswered question. But it was a very proper relationship. By all accounts, it was nothing more than a very, very, very platonic relationship. Clara was very much in love with her husband, and Robert understood that. And even after Robert Schumann died, and maybe Brahms felt that this would be his chance, it seemed that Clara was even more married to Robert. And that actually they separated for a while, but it is under these circumstances that the first piano concerto that you're going to hear tonight was written. We have a lot of letters that go back and forth around this time, so we know a lot about how this concerto came about. There's another character in the story who is Joseph Joachim. Joseph Joachim was a fantastic violinist, actually concertmaster of the Hanover Court Orchestra, and later Brahms would write the violin concerto for him. And Joachim and Brahms exchanged a lot of letters, and in many ways Joachim was kind of like the guy in the middle, passing like little notes under the table to Clara and back and forth. It was actually a very good relationship. But we have plenty of letters where Brahms kept thinking about how to write a concerto. Originally, he wanted to write a two-piano piece, a two-piano sonata for himself and Clara. But around the same time in 1854, he went to Cologne, and he got to hear the first performance himself of Beethoven 9th. And he was so blown away by that performance that he said, 2 pianos are not enough for me. I need to write for an orchestra. So the whole 2-piano sonata basically made way for the piano concerto that you're going to hear tonight. Over the next 3 years, while the whole love triangle with Robert being in the insane asylum and Clara being by herself and Johannes Brahms kind of giving her comfort, it is under these circumstances that he starts writing the concerto. And he sends a letter to Joachim, and he sends him, I guess no FedEx, by a coach, sends him parts, sends him manuscripts, and says, give me your thoughts, and please, be brutal. Don't ever tell that to a musician. He was very brutal. Joachim sent back all sorts of erasing what we were thinking here. This is great, keep this. One of the great things, originally Brahms had thought that he wanted to put a piccolo in it, and Brahms said, no, piccolo is really bad, don't bother. And then he started thinking about writing big solos not only for the first, but for the third horn player, and he needed questions about how you write for that instrument. And of course, Brahms had never written much for orchestra. He had mostly written music for the piano, so this was a new thing for him. But Joachim, being not only a conductor and a concertman, was very helpful. So in many ways, I would like to say here, once and for all, that this concerto is as much a product of Johannes Brahms as it is of Joseph Joachim. Because Joachim was a big influence in how this piece was put together. The first performance took place in 1859 with Joachim's own orchestra, with him conducting. And it went pretty well. The piece is very difficult. It tells you a lot about Brahms' ability as a piano player. He was a great virtuoso. He could play the piano. Because even today, by today's standards, this is a piece that you need to have your chops in right order to be able to play a piece like this. After that, the piece was taken to Leipzig with a conductor that was not very sympathetic. More importantly, he didn't give him enough rehearsal time. He was a disaster. And Brahms was kind of bummed out, and he felt that maybe the piece needed some tweaking. And he said, you know what, I like the piece the way it is, I'm not changing anything. And he never did. And that's what you're going to hear tonight. Opus 15, it's an early piece of Brahms, but when you hear it, you're going to hear a lot of the drama, again, of this love triangle. This burning sensation that he has for this woman that was almost 15 years his senior, but for whom he has nothing but absolute and complete love. And they would remain friends until 1897 when she died, and only 6 months later he would die. Brahms never married. This was the love of his life, and would become forever that. And this is the first presentation, I guess, we have of those feelings. So when you hear the music and you hear the drama, think of poor Johannes. That frustration he must have felt, seeing this woman that he loved, especially after she becomes available. And still, it doesn't develop into what he had hoped, only in his imagination and in his mind, and more importantly, in his music. Thank you and enjoy the concert.